The bill deals with the disaster request based upon the FEMA match from this year's June 20th storm, and it appropriates $4.5 million from the general fund for the purposes of that storm. And I think members understand that this is based upon the FEMA requirements, where FEMA provides 75% of the appropriation. State or local match, then it's 25%. In this instance, the state is made up for the local match as well.
We assume that because FEMA comes in and we approve the 25%, that therefore we've got everything covered. And yet, for example, the city of Worthington has over $900,000 of costs that are not covered by the FEMA rules and or the state rules. We can go in and trim the branches that have actually broken, but we can't, if the tree is so badly mangled it has to be taken down. We can't pay for that. We can't pay for the stump removal. We can't pay for the tree replacement. Well, the truth of the matter is, when you had almost every branch, even branches the size of my little finger, that are covered by 3 inches of ice, there is a massive amount of damage. And also, when you go into the rules, originally our communities were told that, you know, their city employees, their time, both regular and overtime, could be submitted for compensation. And yet, then all of a sudden the rules changed. No, it's only the overtime hours, even though federal law says that both regular and overtime can be covered. You know, they could have went out and hired the private sector. They could have went out and hired people to come in and take care of those trees. But quite frankly, with the lack of available people, who would have then been there to take the tree off of Grandpa and Grandma's house in the private sector? No one. And so the cities went ahead, spent the time and the energy to go remove the trees from the public improvements, from the streets, and as a result, they don't get compensated for that fact. Senator Newman referred to the REAs, and yes, they are covered by FEMA. And yet many of the REAs in my area who lost hundreds and hundreds of poles come to find out that, well, all of a sudden, yes, you're covered, but oh, if you didn't have a previous disaster plan in place, now we probably aren't going to cover that. Although no one really knew about that requirement in the first place. And so I think we need to really step back. I think we need to work with our federal counterparts to go to them and say, hey, there are some changes that need to be made in the FEMA program.
Back in June, the storms that came through seemed like they skipped all over. Some counties in the pathway weren't declared disaster areas and others were. Western Minnesota and central Minnesota got hit harder, skipped over, came back and hit Hennepin County. Those storms come through, you know it. But members and the public, we also need to be cognizant of the disaster that could occur and is occurring by not fixing the bad tax policy that was snuck in on the citizens and the consumers of the state of Minnesota the last day of session. I just got another email from Wheaton, Minnesota. Repeal the warehousing tax because it's affecting jobs in our area. I've talked to farmers, dairy farmers, that happen to have livestock equipment go down the first week of July, an $800 additional bill on their repair. That is a disaster we also need to be cognizant of.
I hope today that we're setting the stage for 2014 and that we come in here on, I believe it's February 25th, and get about the job of dealing with these extremely negative, counterproductive taxes which are going to affect Minnesota's economy, because it is true. We've heard about it from too many sectors of our society already, that these are not good, that they're not in the interest of the good and welfare of the state of Minnesota, and that we ought to, and hopefully we will, in 2014, get rid of these certain provisions which we're all hearing about.
I do think we need to do some more work. There's been some talk about, do we really need to have a special session to deal with a disaster maybe of a relatively small magnitude? I'm not an expert on the constitutional issues that may be raised by short-circuiting that process, but I know there are other issues raised. Senator Miller had mentioned some things that sometimes in these disaster proclamations you might have segments of a county that may have a particularly high level of need that doesn't get addressed because the county itself doesn't reach the threshold. It seems to me there are some things that we should look at in the next session about how we handle disasters more generally, and I hope that next session we begin to take a harder look at some of that in the process itself.